welcome you on the behalf of UAE Islamic Society. As you all know, this is our Islamic Awareness Week, and this is our third talk. Talk for today is why does God permit suffering, pain, or tragedy? This will be given by Adam Deen. Adam Deen website we'd like to, so that you can stay in touch with him. Adam Deen is an international public speaker and broadcaster. He's been working in the field of Muslim apologetics for almost a decade, speaking at over 30 university campuses across the UK. He regularly debates with prominent academics on issues ranging from religious philosophy and theology. His work draws on contemporary philosophy to defend Islam. He frequently appears on mainstream TV, including BBC, and was a former Islamic channel presenter. So I would like you all to help me welcome him today, and without further delay, Adam Deen.
Okay, so in the name of God, most merciful, most kind, I'd like to begin by thanking the Islamic Society here for inviting me. I think it's my first bit of time that I've actually spoken here, and thank you all for turning up, and inshallah you'll find the event to be informative and also enlightening. So the topic for this evening is, why does God allow suffering and evil in the world? Now, as Muslims, we believe in an all-powerful God that is responsible for the creation of the universe. But not only do we have a God that is personal and is also powerful, but we also have we believe in a God that is also moral, that has moral attributes, that is the locus of all that is good and moral in the universe. However, some have argued that this is incompatible, that such a being, such a God, cannot exist because of the evil and suffering in the world. That such a being, even if a powerful God did exist, that even if such a being was even possible, given the fact that there's so much evil in the world, that if there was a God, it would effectively be an evil God, if a God was even possible. So what I'm going to do this evening is to show you how how we can provide an argument, a cogent response to these claims by, let's say, atheists, if you like. I think it's important that we outline that who shoulders the burden of proof, that this is an atheist argument against theists, or an atheist argument against Islam. That the burden of proof is on the shoulders of the one who is putting forward the argument, not the one who is trying to counter the argument. I think that's very important that we set this out, because by shifting the burden, that would commit one to be intellectually dishonest. So how can we show that if God does exist, that he is essentially a good God? I think a good starting point, with a humorous point, would be the very fact that Richard Dawkins exists and carries on the way that he does, and God doesn't strike him down dead, shows that God is a merciful God, is a kind God, because he allows him to carry on doing what he's doing and gives him a little bit of time to maybe, let's say, repent or contemplate his actions. But yeah, that's I always give that initial response, and it doesn't always go down too well. But do we have anything that is more grounded, not sort of humorous? Yes, we do. And I think it's important to outline that the problem of evil, if you like, as this argument is characterized as, is probably one of the strongest arguments from the atheist side against those that believe in God. And it comes in two forms, what we would say the logical and also the probabilistic versions of the argument. Now, what do we mean by the logical? This is the essence of the the logical argument is that the existence of God being all-loving or a good God is incompatible with the existence of evil in the world. That this is a contradiction, right? This is an utter contradiction. And they have, so what this argument has is two premises. The first is an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, i.e. or good God, exists, and the second, that evil exists. And what they're saying are these two propositions, these premises, are incompatible. So then God cannot, and the very fact that evil does exist, number two, is true, we cannot have the first premise, that God exists. So therefore it must mean that such a being cannot exist. However, through analysing this argument, strictly adhering to logic, there is no contradiction there. There is no contradiction there. There's no explicit contradiction there. Because a contradiction means that one accepts P and not P. Proposition and the negation of that proposition. So for example, all basketball players are tall, and I said what's also true is all basketball players are not tall. That would be a contradiction, having the assertion and its negation within the same claim. That would be a contradiction. Now, in order for the logical argument against God being all good, there has to be an explicit contradiction there. But what we find is an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God exists and evil exists. They're not the negation of one another. So therefore, this is not an explicit contradiction. Does everyone get that so far? No? No one gets it so far? Show me hands if you gets it. Is everyone following? Just so I know where I'm going with this. Okay? Good. I'm going to make this more interactive. Right? Okay, so it's clear to me, and it's hopefully clear to you, that there isn't an explicit contradiction there. Right? Like all basketball players are tall, all basketball players are not tall. So what is that? There must be an implicit contradiction there. An implicit assumption within the claims that are being put forward. Now, those assumptions are the following. That if God is omnipotent, then he can create any world that he desires. Right? If he's all-powerful, then he must be able to create any type of world. Second is if God is omnibenevolent or good, then he prefers a world without any evil in the world. Right? So there's two assumptions there, which seem quite plausible, which seem quite convincing. That God can do anything right, so he can create any world, and if he can create any world, then he must be able to bring out a world where there's no evil in it. And not only that, but he would actually prefer a world where there's no evil. And according to the proponents of this argument, the very fact that we do have a world with evil in it means, therefore, that gives us an indication, a reason to believe that such a being does not exist. Because if a being like that existed, then we wouldn't have the world that we have around us. We would have a very, very different world with no evil. Since God can create any world, he should have created a world with no evil. David Hume summarized the logical version of the internal problem very nicely. He says, is he willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil. So what David Hume is saying here is, if he can't do it, then he's not omnipotent. If he can do it, then is he not willing? And if he's not willing, then is this an evil God? Right? The conclusion is, then God must be, if there even exists such a thing as God, then he must be an evil God. So how do we overcome these objections? How do we tackle these assumptions? Well, what we find is that those assumptions are flawed. And those two assumptions, the extra ones that we spoke about, 3 and 4, were what? That God can create any world that he wants, and the fourth one is that if he was benevolent and good God, that he would prefer a world where there's no evil over any other world. So, but these assumptions are flawed. So we started out by arguing that it's not a contradiction. Then we teased out, if you like, the implicit contradictions, and then what we find is that they're actually unfounded. Now let me explain. Before I go on to that, I think it's important that I outline what does it mean to be omnipotent, all-powerful. Typically, God's omnipotence is defined as ability to do all things that are logically possible. It does not make sense to ask the question, can God catch a bus? Right? You may encounter some people that think that's a very good question, but it's not. It doesn't actually make sense. Right? It's like saying, can God catch a banana? Right? Now, the kids are finding this funny. That's good, right? But even they can work out that it doesn't actually make sense. So, and again, equally, we can say, can God create a squared circle? Who thinks that God can create a squared circle? You do?
Well, I think God can do anything.
Ah, right. Okay, great. Example A, right? God can do everything. God can do what is logically possible. To say can God create a squared circle is an unintelligible question. It does not make sense. You might as well say, can God create a jiggly boogly? It does not make sense, right? So if we answer no, that God can't create a squared circle, it does not undermine God's power in any way, because the question must make sense. So that's established, right? Now, oh, just to add to that before I move on. Suppose you're in an exam. Suppose you're in an exam, and there was a question that didn't make sense, and you didn't answer it. Would it make sense for you to lose marks for not answering that question? If you were penalised for not answering a question that didn't make sense, would you think that would be fair? What would be your defence to your lecturer? It would be, but the question doesn't make sense. You got an F because you didn't answer this question. But you would say, but the question doesn't make sense. You're not engaging with my abilities to answer the question if the question does not make sense. So we can find this kind of reasoning to be intuitive, that we kind of employ this kind of reasoning in our day-to-day lives. So, now how does this help us by establishing what we mean by omnipotence? How does this help us in answering these questions? How does it help us in answering those assumptions? Now, it says here that God can create any world possible. So why didn't God create a world where there was only good? Why didn't he create good people? Just purely good people that constantly did good deeds, so that everybody, when they're encountered in a position when they saw, for example, money on the floor, right? No, actually make it more interesting. I saw a £5 note coming out of this brother's pocket, and as I walk past him, I get the feeling to steal it, and I do, right? But why didn't God create, well, I wouldn't do that, by the way. But why didn't God create a world where every time I was given the opportunity to do something bad, I just did good? Why didn't he create that? Who here has been challenged with this kind of thinking? Yeah, good. Excellent, you're in a good lecture then. Let's see if we can answer that. What the problem with this idea is that it overlooks something very, very important, and that is free will. In order to have God always guarantee that we always do good deeds or act in a good way, would be to ask to do this: that God makes us, forces us
to freely choose good. But who can spot the contradiction there? You can spot the contradiction there. What you're saying is that God should make us freely choose something, but make us freely choose something. That is a contradiction. In order for us to choose, we must be free agents. But if God forces us to do good deeds, you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't have free will on one hand, and also guarantee that we will choose good. So that's a contradiction. So what the atheist, or let's say a proponent of this argument, is suggesting is a contradiction. It does not make sense. They're asking us to create a squared circle. Right? It's a contradiction. It does not make sense. So one could then say, okay, fine, right, I understand. We can't have free will and be forced to do good deeds. We can't guarantee that we will always do good. But why didn't God create a world without free will and just created beings that just did good deeds? Robots, if you like. Why didn't he create that? Why did he create us with free will, which has resulted in us doing good and bad, regardless of if one outweighs the other? Why didn't he do that? Because God is interested in moral beings. He's not interested in robots. Think about it. If we had a world where we had just beings which are effectively angels, because angels only do good things, right? Good deeds. Their actions are always good. They always follow the commandments of God. God is not interested in creating those beings. Why? Because he's looking for moral agents. But praise and blame only make sense if the person has a choice. People can only be moral agents. They can only be classified as moral beings if they have choice to do such things. So to claim that God would have preferred a world with no evil and only good overlooks this, that God is looking for people that are moral agents, that people actually chose to do good over bad. Because that being, say for example I put a gun to this brother's head and I said, give money to charity, and he does so. Do we praise him for that? No, we don't, do we? Because he had no choice in the matter. He was coerced into doing it. But if I take the gun away and I say, brother, you know, you should give money to charity, and he does so, what changes that? He decides to do that, right? So God is prefers a world where people choose to do good. So what we find is that when we look at these claims by proponents of the problem of evil, if you like, and we have deeper philosophical consideration, then those arguments seem to wither away. They're not so appealing. Okay, so the logical version is clear that the logical version is not a good argument against a good God, a benevolent God. What about the argument to say, okay, right, fine, it's not a contradiction, but it's given the fact there is a tremendous amount of evil in the world, which there is a tremendous amount of suffering and evil in the world, it's unlikely that God exists. That is a good God. Right? So it's probabilistic. Given the odds, given the probability of there being so much evil in the world, so much suffering, it's really unlikely that such a God exists, if he even exists. Sure. Well, I'd like to say 2 points here. Probabilities are relative to a backdrop. So suppose, for example, we were told that Jack was a university student and 90% of students play football. Now, relative to that background information, it would make it highly probable that Jack likes football, right? But suppose then we find out that Jack is disabled and 90% of disabled people do not play football. Do you see how our claims change according to the background information? It drastically changes. You see, so probabilities only make sense according to the information that you have to begin with. So when we say that it's improbable that God exists, given the evil in the world, but we say relative to what? Are we saying that the only thing that we have for God's existence is the evil in the world? Is that all that we have? Well, if that's the case, then it would seem that it's a good argument. If all that you had in the world was blatant evil in your face, 24/7, and nothing else to support God's existence, then fair enough. That's great. But there are a tremendous amount of arguments, compelling, cogent arguments for the existence of God. Let me name you some. For example, God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe. God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. God is the best explanation for objective morality in the world. And so forth, and so forth, and so forth. There are many arguments for the existence of God. So, with that in the background, it's not probable that that God, or a good God, does not exist. It's actually it would be the other way around. That it's more likely that God does exist, that is good. Now the second point I'd like to argue here, that if one says that because of the evil in the world, God does exist, it is arguing from ignorance, pure ignorance. Because one doesn't have the ability to decipher or to determine if that evil is pointless. How do we know? How can we decide that the evil in the world that we have today is utterly pointless? How can we know that? And to assert and to say that it is utterly pointless is to argue from ignorance. Now, to support this, I want to draw upon a problem, an ethical problem in ethical theory called utilitarianism, to achieve the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Now, a genuine problem with this principle, this ethical principle, is this, that what we perceive to be good today might turn out to be tremendously evil later on. And vice versa. What we decide to see to be good today may turn out, evil today may turn out to be good later on. Right? And so forth. And that is a genuine problem in this theory. Now, we're doing exactly the same thing. The person who's arguing and saying that the evil around us today can never be accounted for is arguing from simply by ignorance. So, just because we don't see in our narrow framework, it doesn't mean that there is a reason behind that evil and suffering in the world. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean there's no reason. Let me give an analogy. Okay, so there's a door here, and behind this door there's an activity happening, right? And I'm going to pick on you again. So what I do is I give everybody in this room an envelope, a sealed envelope. What's your name again, brother?
Abdurrahman.
Abdurrahman. Abdurrahman, I send Abdurrahman into that room. Abdurrahman goes into that room. Remember, I've given all of you an envelope, but not Abdurrahman. Abdurrahman goes into that room. He stays for about 3 or 4 minutes. He comes out. He's petrified. He's shocked. And we ask Abdurrahman, what did you see? And he says, I saw a man sawing a man's leg off. The man was in agony. He was screaming. There was blood squirting everywhere. It was a horrific sight. So we say, Abdurrahman, sit down, calm down, sit down. Then I send all of you to have a look. Right? You go in there and you see exactly the same thing. You're all mortified by the sight. Sorry kids, I know this is a bit AT, but bear with me. Sorry mum. So all of you are mortified by seeing what you've seen. And then I ask all of you to open the envelope. And you open the envelope and it says that the man sawing the man's leg is a doctor. The person who's having their leg sawed off is a patient. And if he does not have his leg cut off, he'll die from gangrene. What happens to all of you? Your emotional state changes, does it not? But Abdurrahman is saying, you people are vile. How can you accept what's happening there? How can you just sit there? That envelope that Abdurrahman does not have is the knowledge of God. when God allows the evil and suffering in the world, he knows something which you do not. There is an insightful verse in the Quran. When God decided to create Adam and bring human beings to the world, the angels who just follow out those commands were perplexed. They thought, right, this being is going to bring a lot of bloodshed in the world. Why is this happening? Why is our Lord want us to do this? So they went up to Allah, they went up to God, and they wanted to ask him, not to challenge him, but to ask the wisdom behind his decision. And what did Allah say? What did God say? He says, I know what you do not know. So my friends, brothers and sisters, folks, to argue that the evil in the world is pointless is pure arguing from ignorance, speculation. Now, the atheist could say, or the proponent of this argument could say, well, what is the reason behind it? But might I add that it's not up to us to give the explanation behind it. It is for the atheist, or the one arguing this argument, to show that it is pointless. Remember who burdens the proof here? The atheist. It's their argument. But I can also say this, that we do know, because Allah, God in the Quran says this. He says that the finite suffering in this world will be infinitely compensated in the next world. That this is to test to see the believer has real faith. That the suffering in this world is a challenge for the believer. Does he go, oh my God, why is this happening to me? Or does he say, I trust that God has looked after me and it will be good in the end. So what we find again is that the logical version doesn't work. It's not a logical contradiction. And also the likelihood or the probabilistic version doesn't add up. It's just arguing from ignorance. I'd like to also say this as well. Think about it for a second. When someone is arguing that such a God does not exist, what are they assuming? What are they assuming? They're assuming that such a thing called evil exists in the absence of God. Where does he get this, or where does he or she get this notion of evil? If God doesn't exist, there is no notion of good and evil. There is just prudential interest. What is prudential? Right? I ought to run to catch the bus. I ought. That's not a moral proposition. That's not a moral discourse. Such things as mercy, virtue, compassion, where do we find these in the world if we don't ground them in God? What I'm saying here is this, that to actually identify evil, the category evil, is actually an evidence that God exists, that is moral. If objective evil exists, then God exists. Objective evil exists, therefore God exists. If anyone has any more questions about this, I'm more than willing to elaborate on that argument. But I would say this also, that I don't want to end there, but I want to say this, that the problem of evil is not a problem for Muslims or theists, it is actually a problem for atheism. I have an extract here from Samuel Jackson, not the actor, he's I think a historian stroke philosopher, in The Prose of Suffering and the Practice of Silence. And here he discusses the evil committed in Sierra Leone, and he conducts an interview with a lady called Fina Kamara. And this is what she says. She says, "We were hiding in a bush for 3 months," she began. "We were afraid of the RUF might come at any time and attack the town. But when we received messages from the Free Town and from the Eco-Mog to come out of the bush and return to home, to return to our town. So we came out of the bush, and one day we went to our farm to plant groundnuts. We returned to the town that afternoon. Suddenly we heard gunshots. Now, because there were Eco-Mob soldiers in Condambia, we were, pardon my pronunciation, bear with me, we were used to hearing gunfire, but this time we were confused. The RUF came suddenly. They shot many people. They stacked the bodies under the cotton tree. Then they grabbed us. Their leader said they were going to kill us. But then they sent their boys to bring a knife. My daughter, Damba, was 6. They took her from me and cut off her hands. After that, they cut off all of our hands. One man died because of the bleeding. We fell to the ground. After some time, we got up. Damba said, "Mummy, I'm thirsty." By now, all the houses were on fire. We went behind one of the houses. One RUF boy came and said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I want to give water to my daughter." I gave Damba some water. Then I sat down and tied her to my back. We began running again, but they stopped us in the backyard of one of the houses. One RUF girl said, "You move one step, I'll shoot you." I had to go back, but there was a place behind one of the homes, and a while later I overheard the RUF soldier saying that we need to leave, it's time to leave. When they had gone, I picked up my small son, Damba, on my back again and went to the bush. From there, I came out on the road and sat down. I met my husband and uncle there, and in the morning we set off for Kabbalah. We did not reach Kabbalah that day because of the pain. It took us 2 days. People in Kabbalah said we were lucky. The Red Cross were there. After treating us, they brought us by helicopter to Freetown here. We were taken to Coconut Hospital. They treated us there. Then we were taken to Waterloo. When the RUF invaded Freetown, we had to flee from Waterloo. We fled to the stadium. From there, we are brought to this camp. If you ask me, this is all I know. This is all I know. We are just ordinary people. We were farmers. We had nothing to do with the government. Whenever I think about this, and about the time they cut off my hand and my daughter's hand, only 6 years of age, I feel so bad. Our children are here now. They are not going to school. Every morning we are given vulgar. Not enough for us to eat. We are really suffering now. I hope that one day we can return home. If life ends at the grave, then what justice is there for Fina? What can we possibly say to Fina? If life just ends when we die, what justice will Fina see? Utterly nothing. If there is no God, life is what it is. Life is bitter and cruel and ends in this way. But if God does exist, what we will have is that righteousness will be rewarded, evil will be punished, and God will balance the scales of justice. So, evil is not a problem for Muslims or people that believe in God, but evil is a problem for those that don't. Thank you for listening. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.